My parents gave my brother the entire family fortune and disowned me, so when he bankrupted them, I legally absorbed their empire for one single dollar. I am 32 years old, and I am the founder and absolute majority shareholder of a globally recognized highly elite corporate cybersecurity firm. My entire existence is built upon absolute digital fortification, zero-trust architecture, and the meticulous dismantling of hostile network threats. I manage massive contracts for international banking institutions, securing billions of dollars in highly sensitive assets. My journey to this position was not paved with family money. It was forged in the fires of complete, vicious abandonment. My parents owned a massive, highly lucrative international shipping and logistics corporation. When I turned 18 years old, I assumed I would be brought into the family fold to help modernize their aging digital infrastructure. Instead, my parents sat me down in their lavish, sprawling estate and delivered a completely devastating ultimatum. They informed me that my older brother Julian was officially appointed as the sole successor and chief executive officer of the entire family empire. Julian was a deeply arrogant, breathtakingly incompetent man who spent his university years throwing lavish parties and barely passing his introductory business courses. My parents demanded that I drop out of my advanced computer science program and accept a minimum wage position as Julian's personal administrative assistant. When I completely refused, demanding respect and a seat at the table I deserved, my parents did not hesitate. They entirely disowned me. They cut off my university funding, stripped my name from the family trust, and literally threw my belongings out onto the driveway. They told me I would be an absolute failure without their money. I spent the next 10 years sleeping on second-hand mattresses, working grueling 100-hour weeks and coding proprietary security algorithms until my fingers bled. While I built an impenetrable digital fortress and amassed a personal net worth stretching into the hundreds of millions of dollars, Julian was busy driving my family's legacy directly into a concrete wall. Julian treated the corporate logistics firm like a limitless personal slush fund. He leased fleets of private jets, bought massive coastal properties, and completely ignored the desperately needed upgrades to the company's aging network security. He surrounded himself with sycophants and fired anyone who dared to question his catastrophic financial decisions. My parents turned a completely blind eye, blindly funding his delusions while their shipping empire slowly rotted from the inside out. I had not spoken to them in exactly 14 years. I believed the silence would last for the rest of my natural life. I was staggeringly, profoundly wrong. Exactly 3 weeks ago on a rainy Tuesday morning, I was sitting in my massive, glass-walled penthouse office overlooking the city skyline. The heavy oak doors to my private suite suddenly burst open, entirely bypassing my executive security team. My parents and Julian barged into my office. They did not look like the untouchable corporate royalty who had discarded me a decade ago. They looked absolutely, completely decimated. Julian's bespoke suit was completely wrinkled. He was sweating profusely, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold his expensive leather briefcase. My parents looked physically ill, their faces drained of all color, entirely stripped of their usual, suffocating arrogance. They had not come to apologize for throwing me away. They had come to demand a massive, immediate rescue. Julian collapsed into one of my guest chairs and began hyperventilating. Through a series of frantic, panicked stammers, he revealed the absolute depth of his catastrophic incompetence. His massive logistics network had been hit by a devastating, highly sophisticated ransomware attack. A hostile international syndicate had entirely encrypted their global shipping manifests, their financial routing numbers, and their massive client databases. The syndicate had locked down their entire physical fleet. The hostile hackers had issued an absolute non-negotiable ultimatum. They demanded a ransom payment of exactly $50 million, payable in untraceable cryptocurrency within exactly 48 hours, or they would publicly release the highly classified corporate data and permanently wipe the mainframes, effectively bankrupting the family empire in a single keystroke. I sat completely still behind my massive desk, watching the golden child completely unravel right in front of my eyes. When you spend your entire professional life analyzing malicious intrusions and dismantling digital traps, you develop an incredibly sharp instinct for deception. You learn to look past the surface-level panic and examine the underlying code of a person's behavior. My parents did not fall to their knees and beg for my forgiveness. Even in the face of total apocalyptic financial ruin, their staggering arrogance remained entirely intact. My father slammed his hands down on my polished desk, demanding that I immediately deploy my elite team of cybersecurity engineers to completely eradicate the hostile ransomware. He did not offer to pay my firm's standard emergency response fee, which easily stretches into the millions of dollars. He explicitly stated that it was my absolute familial duty to rescue my brother's legacy for free. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, entirely unfazed by his pathetic demands. I asked Julian a very specific, highly technical question regarding the exact entry point of the hostile malware. Julian's face turned a violent, sickening shade of crimson. He began stammering uncontrollably, his eyes darting around my expansive office. Under the crushing pressure of my interrogation, the absolute horrifying truth finally spilled out of his mouth. Julian had not simply clicked on a malicious email attachment in a desperate, deeply illegal attempt to artificially inflate his failing company's quarterly earnings. Julian had attempted to hire a shady data mining firm to steal proprietary shipping routes from a massive international competitor. Instead of securing the data, he had accidentally granted a notorious hacker syndicate complete administrative access to his own internal networks. But the sheer sociopathic cherry on top of this disaster was the specific leverage the hackers held over his head. Julian confessed that the syndicate had discovered a massive trove of entirely forged corporate contracts on his server. In order to secure massive loans from foreign banks, Julian had illegally forged my legal signature and used the name of my prestigious cybersecurity firm as a false guarantor on his corporate debt. He had committed massive, felony-level wire fraud and identity theft. If the hackers released that specific server data, Julian would not just lose the family company. He would face a mandatory minimum sentence of exactly 25 years in a federal penitentiary for international corporate fraud. My parents stood there entirely silent, expecting me to simply wave my hand and erase their beloved son's massive felonies. I did not scream. I did not throw them out of my penthouse suite. A completely cold, incredibly calculated wrath washed over my entire mind. I looked directly at Julian and told him I would construct a highly advanced proprietary decryption key to entirely purge the hostile syndicate from his servers before the 48-hour deadline expired. I promised to completely secure the forged documents and save him from federal prison. My parents practically collapsed with relief, entirely believing I had finally submitted to my role as the subservient younger sibling. I told them I needed exactly 12 hours to write the code and draft the standard liability waivers. I instructed them to return to my boardroom the next morning. The moment they left my office, I locked the doors, poured myself a glass of cold water, and summoned my absolute most ruthless corporate acquisitions attorney. I was not going to rescue their crumbling empire. I was going to legally, methodically swallow it whole. I sat with my attorney deep into the night, drafting an incredibly dense, 200-page corporate rescue and liability transfer agreement. The document looked like a standard, highly complex cybersecurity service contract. It featured massive blocks of dense technical jargon regarding data encryption, server restoration, and digital liability caps. But buried completely inconspicuously in the absolute center of the document, camouflaged by pages of boring legal definitions, was a completely ironclad, irrevocable corporate acquisition clause. The clause explicitly stated that in exchange for the deployment of the proprietary decryption software and the assumption of the massive corporate liability, Julian and my parents were legally surrendering exactly 100% of their voting shares, equity, and absolute ownership of the logistics empire directly to my holding company. The contract literally transferred the entire family legacy, including their massive physical warehouses and their global shipping fleet, directly into my sole name for the grand, legally binding purchase price of exactly $1. It was an absolute masterpiece of legal destruction. I printed the massive stack of papers, bound them in a heavy black leather portfolio, and waited for the golden child to willingly sign his own execution order. The atmosphere in my massive, glass-walled corporate boardroom the following morning was thick with an incredibly suffocating, entirely palpable desperation. The massive digital clock on the wall indicated that they had exactly 3 hours left before the hostile hacker syndicate permanently wiped the servers and released the forged corporate loan documents to the international authorities. My parents and Julian sat rigidly at the far end of the sprawling mahogany table. Julian looked completely unhinged. He had clearly not slept a single minute. He was violently bouncing his leg under the table, completely chewing his fingernails down to the quick, absolutely terrified of spending the next 25 years wearing a federal prison uniform. I walked into the boardroom entirely composed, wearing a perfectly tailored suit, projecting an aura of absolute unshakable control. I carried the heavy black leather portfolio and dropped it directly onto the polished wood, right in front of Julian. The thick stack of legal paper hit the table with a heavy, definitive thud that actually made my father jump in his expensive chair. I looked down at Julian and handed him a heavy silver fountain pen. I informed them that my elite engineering team had successfully isolated the hostile intrusion. I told them that the proprietary decryption key was fully compiled and ready to be deployed to their infected mainframes. However, I explained, keeping my voice incredibly flat and entirely devoid of emotion, the deployment required their absolute legal authorization. I told them the massive document was a standard comprehensive liability transfer designed to completely shield my cybersecurity firm from any collateral damage caused by the hackers. My mother impatiently tapped her manicured fingers against the table, demanding that Julian sign the paperwork immediately so they could return to their lavish, uninterrupted lives. Julian's hands were shaking so incredibly badly he could barely hold the silver pen. He flipped open the heavy leather portfolio and stared at the dense walls of legal text. He had a brief, fleeting moment to actually read the clauses. He had the opportunity to flip to the center pages and discover that he was legally signing away the entire multi-million-dollar family legacy for a single dollar bill. But his mind was completely paralyzed by pure, unadulterated terror. He was not thinking about corporate equity or voting shares. He was solely, desperately focused on avoiding a massive federal indictment for his incredibly stupid wire fraud. His completely arrogant, lazy brain simply could not process the possibility that the younger sibling he had bullied and discarded his entire life was capable of outsmarting him. He didn't read a single sentence. Julian frantically pressed the silver pen to the signature lines. He signed his name over and over again, his messy signature bleeding across the heavy parchment. When he finished, I silently slid the massive portfolio over to my parents. Because the corporate charter required the majority board members to authorize a liability transfer of this magnitude, their signatures were absolutely legally required to complete the acquisition. My father scoffed, muttered something derogatory about how long it was taking me to fix his son's minor technical glitch, and aggressively signed the documents. My mother blindly followed suit, completely willingly signing away the last remaining shreds of their generational wealth without glancing at a single word. They pushed the heavy portfolio back across the mahogany table. Julian let out a massive, shuddering breath, slumping back in his chair like a man who had just been pulled from a burning building. He looked at me, a smug, incredibly entitled smirk slowly creeping back onto his pale face. He casually instructed me to deploy the software and entirely clean up his mess. I reached across the table, picked up the incredibly heavy portfolio, and slowly tucked it securely under my arm. I inspected the fresh black ink. I felt the physical weight of the legal acquisition in my hands. The entire shipping empire, the massive warehouses, the physical fleets, and the absolute control of my family's legacy were completely, entirely mine. No hostile takeovers. No drawn-out board battles. I slowly turned around and walked over to the massive digital clock mounted on the boardroom wall. And then, the entire atmosphere in the room completely instantly shifted. I stopped acting like the obedient, subservient younger brother. I squared my shoulders, entirely dropping the facade of familial duty. I turned back to face them, and I smiled. A completely cold, absolutely terrifying, entirely merciless smile. And then, I dropped the absolute final hammer on their entirely shattered reality. I stood completely still at the head of the polished mahogany table, the heavy black leather portfolio resting securely beneath my arm. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere inside that expansive corporate boardroom shifted in a single, staggering heartbeat. I no longer resembled the discarded, desperate teenager they had thrown out onto the street 14 years ago. I was an apex predator standing entirely inside my own fortress. Julian looked up at me from his leather chair, his bloodshot eyes narrowed just a fraction of an inch. His profoundly lazy, entitled brain was finally catching up, realizing that something was fundamentally, irreparably wrong with the ecosystem of this room. "Why are you just standing there?" Julian demanded, his voice trembling violently as he glanced at the ticking clock on the wall. "Deploy the decryption key. We have exactly 2 hours before the syndicate releases the forged bank loans to the federal authorities." I let out a very slow, profoundly calm sigh. "There is no proprietary decryption key, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the silent room like a sharply honed blade. The three of them froze as if they had been struck by an absolute sub-zero blizzard. My father literally stopped breathing. My mother's jaw dropped open, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated shock. I looked right into Julian's terrified eyes, and I systematically dismantled his entire fabricated universe. "I'm not deploying a rescue package," I explained, keeping my tone incredibly flat and entirely unwavering. "I'm not saving your infected servers. I am not stopping the international syndicate from releasing your forged documents to the federal prosecutors. You are entirely, completely on your own." Julian stopped breathing. He stared at me, utterly unable to process the staggering truth rolling off my tongue. I tapped the heavy legal folder containing the freshly signed corporate acquisition documents securely tucked under my arm. "I am a master of digital architecture," I told him, my voice dripping with profound, unfiltered disgust. "Did you honestly, truly believe you could secretly commit massive federal wire fraud using my company's name, accidentally invite a hostile ransomware syndicate into your own network, and I would just bow my head and save your pathetic life for free?" I did not draft a liability waiver. I drafted a total, irrevocable corporate acquisition contract. My father started stammering uncontrollably. His face morphed into a violent, sickening shade of crimson. The catastrophic realization of what I had just orchestrated slammed into his arrogant, obsolete brain. He realized I had just legally tricked them into surrendering the entirety of their multi-million-dollar physical assets, their warehouses, and their remaining equity for exactly $1. He lunged forward, screaming like a wounded animal. He reached across the polished wood, desperately trying to snatch the heavy legal folder right out from under my arm. "You set us up," my father roared, his voice cracking with undeniable, helpless rage. "You are a profoundly sick, twisted monster. We did not agree to sell the company. Give those acquisition papers back right this exact second." I easily stepped back, keeping entirely out of his frantic reach. "No," I said quietly. "It was a staggering felony-level corporate crime. Julian forged legal loan documents. He committed massive grand larceny and identity theft. And because all three of you were in such a profoundly blind, terrifying panic over his own incredible incompetence, you just legally signed away every single shred of the family empire you thought you owned." I shifted my gaze directly to Julian, who was completely weeping silently in his chair. As the absolute majority owner and newly appointed chief executive officer of the logistics firm, I said, making absolutely certain my voice echoed off the glass walls, "My very first official act is to terminate your employment entirely. You are officially fired. And because I now own the physical servers, I am legally handing the evidence of your massive wire fraud directly over to the federal authorities myself." My mother let out an agonizing, blood-curdling groan. She buried her face in her hands and collapsed forward onto the table. She realized she had just legally signed away her luxurious life, lost her entire generational fortune, and effectively sent her beloved golden child directly to a federal penitentiary in one single morning. I looked down at their violently shaking silhouettes. "My security team is currently waiting in the lobby to escort all three of you out of my building," I told them. "Do not ever attempt to contact me again." I did not wait for their pathetic apologies. I did not listen to my father's unhinged screaming. I turned on my heel, walked entirely out of the boardroom, and locked the acquisition documents inside my heavy steel vault. The legal and personal fallout over the following 8 months was undeniably brutal for my treacherous family. Because I held the absolute concrete proof of their legal signatures, my parents did not dare fight me in civil court. They had completely bankrupted themselves, paying massive legal fees to defend Julian from the federal prosecutors. Julian was officially convicted of massive corporate wire fraud and was sentenced to exactly 15 years in a federal penitentiary. My parents lost their sprawling estate to massive foreclosure. Stripped of their stolen wealth and their unearned arrogance, they were forced to move into a tiny, incredibly cramped apartment on the miserable outskirts of the city, surviving entirely on meager social safety nets. As for me, my life is undeniably a masterpiece. I completely liquidated the corrupted digital infrastructure of their failing logistics company, integrated their massive physical warehouses and shipping fleets into my own corporate portfolio, and expanded my empire by hundreds of millions of dollars. I sleep incredibly peacefully in my penthouse suite. I'm surrounded by genuine success, profound security, and absolute peace, entirely free from parasitic, deeply arrogant opportunists. I learned a staggering, invaluable lesson. The absolute most effective way to completely destroy an entitled, lazy thief is not to scream at them or try to appeal to their non-existent morality. The greatest method is to weaponize their own suffocating panic, step entirely out of the way, and watch them legally, frantically sign away their own existence.